And of course, many people have looked at this issue of pattern, and my favorite, of course, is Christopher Alexander, who spent probably 40 years trying to understand patterns on the belief that they emerge from the systems of the city. So he was a system thinker before systems thinking was fashionable. He's been doing it since the 1960s. And he did that famous book, Pattern Language, which some of you may have on your shelves. But he became frustrated with that more recently, and he's still alive and still working. He became frustrated with the results of those initial attempts to distill good city design into hundreds and hundreds. I think there were 600 or 550 odd patterns. When he and others tried to apply those, he was unsatisfied with the results because they lost some of that organic quality that he was thinking of. So he has more recently favored a set of what he calls fundamental principles. Here is that word principles again, which in this case are clearly patterns in response. He suggests that these are in turn grounded in the fundamental forms of nature itself. And while I don't have time to go through all 15 of these patterns, here you see them. And I've come to see those as influential touchstones for how we can think about design interventions in the city and planning interventions in the city that will capitalize on these systems' strengths and the organic function of city systems that past planning has tended to ignore because of being too tied to mechanistic views of how the city operated. So in our case in Vancouver, these arterials that I previously alluded to have the cultural consequence, if you understand the pattern, of explaining, how to reinforce those patterns of, in this case, a very kind of obvious example of a festival activity that takes place on an arterial. And I hope that the view expresses something about the function of the arterial, but also the placemaking capacity of our arterials here in the city of Vancouver, which in many cases orients you to the larger landscape, because rather than curving away in a false attempt at variety, which many of the new urbanists do, and I consider myself one of them, so I'm not complaining. But in the case of Vancouver, it's quite striking how these straight arterials help us locate ourselves against this larger landscape, which is seen off in the distance with the North Shore Mountains, which are so profound. So the pattern of the city, in this case Vancouver, with its patterns of neighborhood serving arterial, explains why some things can happen and some things can't, and helps urban designers capitalize, planners too, capitalize on the energy inherent in urban patterns. The third one of my favorite, and it shows up in previous works of mine, is this one: apply lighter, greener, cheaper, smarter infrastructure. And that, of course, is as opposed to what we ordinarily do, which is expensive gray, heavy, expensive gray, stupid infrastructure, where we're spending way too much on infrastructure when a dollar spent on infrastructure usually leads to a dollar's worth of environmental degradation, not to mention the impacts on the taxpayer. And these two examples from the apogee of this principle, which is probably Medellin, Colombia, where instead of plowing a highway through these sensitive informal districts, they chose a smarter strategy, which was to use a much less expensive aerial tram system. And that, in concert with a very elegant set of landing points for the tram, where they did minor urban design interventions, took what was socially problematic place and healed it and reintegrated it into the city. That PhD theses could be written probably, and also have been, about that, the elegance of that strategy. So I can only allude to it rather than give you more detail. Before I move on to the image on the right, which is a very pedestrian example, both in the sense of people walking and also very routine pedestrian example of rear lanes in the city of Vancouver, which often are unpaved, which allows the water to infiltrate into the ground. And as you can see by the lush vegetation, the trees are very happy about that circumstance. If you dug down into the lane, you would find the tree root system was actually invading the dirt underneath that lane at a depth of 2 inches and sucking up most of the rainwater that falls on it, keeping that rainwater from the stream systems and reinfiltrating it into the soil, which is the way the natural forest behaves, and at a cost that is basically nothing in comparison to more hardscape examples. Another example of this is in Mendoza, Argentina, which is a city that completely, over hundreds of years, has integrated its agricultural watering system into its urban storm drain system and its urban forestry system. So that you can see in the image on the left, the normal curb and gutter is replaced by an irrigation swale, which flows with water for an hour a day, every day, to water the trees. And on the right-hand side, you see it in a park manifestation. That means infrastructure, that the lighter greener principle means that infrastructure is physically lighter, less concrete, less cost, less environmental impact, and usually more beautiful. And to demonstrate one of the consequences of this is Mendoza is on the left in Argentina, and just a few kilometers away is a similar city, San Juan, which doesn't have the advantage of this irrigation system, unfortunately. And the health of the urban forest in comparison between Mendoza and San Juan could not be more obvious. South America have pioneered this approach to lighter infrastructure. Mendoza, Argentina, in comparison to San Juan, Argentina, just a few miles to the north, demonstrates the benefits of working with, not against, natural systems. And the challenge for you all is to overcome probably 60 years of overspending on infrastructure and working within a context where we are required as planners and designers to disguise and basically banish every element of natural function to the detriment of the taxpayer and to the detriment of natural systems. And it's not going to be an easy thing to overcome. In my own landscape, I've been driven quite crazy by our tendency to overspend on infrastructure. And this is an example from my own tragic landscape where we're about to spend $8 billion on a subway through very low density streetcar city suburbs, in the misguided thinking, in my view, that this will catalyze an innovation corridor going out to UBC at the very end of the peninsula where I work, will catalyze an innovation corridor that will bring high-tech, biotech, and all kinds of great jobs along this corridor. And this is a very standard approach to infrastructure, which I find quite troublesome, thinking that infrastructure is an economic development strategy and that economic development strategies must be organized around an attempt to attract vagrant capital, which can go either to Vancouver or Sydney, Australia, or San Francisco, when in fact 90%, more than 90% of our economy here in Vancouver is local. It's people fixing sewer pipes, it's yoga teachers, it's people stocking grocery shelves that has nothing to do with an innovation corridor. And for the same amount of money as shown on the right, you could reinvigorate the basic structure of the city of Vancouver, which was and is a streetcar-oriented city without the streetcars, which have been removed since the 1950s. If you wanted to reinstill it for less money, you could do so. And I think many North American cities should take a hard look at this 1920s pattern and see if it can be revived in the case of streetcar city suburbs, or instituted for the first time along arterials in suburban contexts, which are also very commonly organized around this pre-existing agrarian grid. If anybody online is from Florida, you know that you have a 1 mile grid system that is still very, very obvious as an armature to think about the next 40 years for your city. So, rule 4, strengthen social resilience through affordable housing. And I really wish I had a lot more time because I want to wrap this up quite rapidly to leave it to your questions. But for many of you, this might be the most important of them. So get the book. And along with climate change, the global crisis in affordable housing will be our overarching challenge. And this has been made clear by many people, including Richard Florida, who used to tout the idea of the creative class as the great savior of cities. More recently, in his new book, The Urban Crisis, he said, "Oh, I was totally wrong. I'm sorry, mea culpa." The idea of the creative class has just exacerbated inequality, and inequality is mostly manifested in most of the so-called successful cities like San Francisco, New York, Washington, D.C., Boston, Toronto, or Vancouver, or Seattle and Portland, and so forth, in housing prices that have gone way beyond the reach of the average wage earner. Even if they are in those high-tech industries, they can't afford to live. And I've given up on the market to fix this problem. I've now said the only way to fix the problem is to take some of the capital flowing into these global cities and turn it into non-market housing. And in Vancouver, fortunately, we have a lot of good examples. 15% of our people already live in non-market housing, even though we stopped building it in the 1990s. If we had not stopped building it, at least 30% of our people would now live in non-market housing. And it can be in the form of restored, what used to be market housing, turning it into non-market housing. It seems to me that that's the only strategy that is going to work in the context of a collapsing middle class, where more wealth is going to the asset owners and less wealth is going to wage earners, no matter what industry you're in. Scalable precedents for nearly universal non-market housing are known and provide the only viable solution, in my view, in the face of global hyperinflation and the price of urban land. And the example I recommend to you is Vienna, where more than 50% of the people in Vienna live in non-market housing. And in fact, the non-market housing sector is so large that they don't have an income requirement. It doesn't matter what your income is. You can, if you want to, live in a non-market housing unit. You don't get to build equity. That's the downside. But more than 50% of Vienna wage earners choose to live in non-market housing because of the housing security it affords. And here's the most interesting part, I think. Because the non-market housing sector in Vienna is as large as the market housing sector, the competition between the market and non-market housing sector has meant that land values in Vienna are a fraction of land values in equivalent cities such as Paris. So that market housing, should you choose to buy market housing in Vienna, is less than half of the cost of similar sized units in Paris. You see what I'm saying? The non-market housing, because of its strength, creates downward pressure on land values in the rest of the city such that market housing is more affordable too. I love this example. I suggested in some of your municipalities, you look for places where you have land. And Vancouver has, in my view, and since I suppose not too many of you online are from Vancouver, I've been advancing the use of $20 billion worth of marginally used golf courses. We have 7 courses in the city, 3 of which are owned by the city. So we have no shortage of golf courses. And if we took that $20 billion, we could create tens of thousands of non-market housing units by using a third of it to making half of it a park, a nature park, using a third of the land that remains, a sixth therefore, selling it at market value and developing housing, and using the profits from that to cross-subsidize the other 2/3 housing, which would be in the tens of thousands of units for non-market housing on those locations. We actually have examples of that in the city that we did in the 70s. We've followed, the neoliberal, what they call the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, where we all got out of the business of providing state-sponsored, public-sponsored housing in the view that only the market can supply it. Yeah, that worked out great, right? Nobody can afford housing. Probably half the people that are listening right now, if you're under the age of 40, are having struggles affording housing. And finally, the last one, and this one, adapt to shift in jobs and wages. You may know all about this, but some people don't. At least 50% of all jobs are now subject to automation. And rather than freeing us from toil, somehow we're working longer hours than ever. If you look at the statistics of how many hours that Americans are working, that's gradually increasing, even though more and more of our work is actually done by machines. What's up with that? And what's up with that is most of this new work that we're working hard on it is in service jobs. It's yoga teachers. There's 500,000 yoga teachers in the United States now, and that grew from basically 0 in 1960. And how many baristas are there in the United States? Probably, 1 million by now. And some industries are actually growing and proliferating, like brew pubs, small scale entrepreneurial activities. The largest manufacturing category in the United States that was actually growing, all the rest are shrinking, was manufacturing entities that employ only one person. Now, what the heck is that? It's certainly not Dow Chemical. It's basically candle makers or cosmetic makers who are working out of their garage. And there's quite a group of those folks who are making a living doing it in small spaces within cities, and planners ought to be looking carefully to see where that is. And this shift to service economy shows up in the rise of the gig economy and the transformation of former rural dwellers into service entrepreneurs in exploding developing countries. And this is my last slide. So I'm making the comparison here between WeWork, which is one of many places where you can, as an entrepreneur and as a gig worker, get a space at a table and set your laptop up there and use their printers and so forth. And that's not unlike what's really happening in places like Mumbai, which is the image on the right-hand side. This is a factory of 2 people making clothing in part of a complex industrial chain, where that shirt you see, the pink shirt you see being made in the background, might end up on the rack at the Gap, or before the Gap went bankrupt last week. So in conclusion, this book dropped into the vortex of the thinking. I'm planning this exact same month that pandemic did just my, that's my art, that it doesn't include the word plague or virus. So I have to revise it because of the pandemic are as important, if not more, than the kinds of things we're talking about. So fourth wave really would all have to. And I thank you for your attention, and I hope you have some questions to fill up the rest of this time, because questions make me feel much more comfortable than this long monologue. So I'll turn it over to our sponsors.
Well, thank you, Patrick. That was a great presentation. Now we're going to move into the question and answer session. And the first one here is has a little bit of a comment in the question here. I'm interested in understanding and hearing your thoughts or opinions around designing for public spaces for recreation, which have become an increasing focus and have taken on a greater importance in these times. You've talked about public space in terms of street margins, like commercial frontages and urban canopy, but what about the perhaps less structured or wider spaces? For context, my agency is currently struggling with a large number of very varied demands on the limited open public space available in our inner city.
Well, that's a great question that I don't address directly in the book, but I do refer to the more recent work of Christopher Alexander and his 15 principles. And if you explore those principles, the essential answer to that question that he would provide is maybe not to think about public spaces in the way that the question is suggesting as divorced from street spaces. He talks about thick wall design or various ways that spaces link up, and the most successful ones that I've seen, and I think he's referring to those as well, are the ones that attach to common thoroughfares. So in that sense, you can think about urban plazas or small cafe courtyards or those kinds of things that I think are under provided, and particularly in North American communities in terms of what we're planning for. We don't often sort of require that from our building developers, or we don't plan that into designs for subdivisions and so forth. Small scale spaces attached to street spaces and surrounded by houses or buildings that can both confine that space and put eyes on the street. That's been the sine qua non of successful spaces, I would argue. So I would pursue that direction.
Okay, thank you. Next question. I love that you have referenced Jane Jacobs. What do you think about incorporating the importance of social infrastructure, emphasizing connectivity and collective responsibility in city development? Please talk about senior housing, NORCs, infrastructure relationships for the future, including the risks for future virus pandemics.
Yeah, wow. The best answer I can give for that one is, the book does concern itself with the disappearance of accessible housing in general. And that is something that affects marginalized communities, special needs communities, and obviously the poor, but increasingly the middle class is having limited access to housing as inequality becomes more exaggerated. So I point back to the strategies used in Vienna, which I'll repeat, are really good, because their strategy is that public housing is not seen as just one thing. Public housing, or taxpayer-supported housing, or non-market housing, however you want to call it, as a general category where 55% of all people in the city of Vienna live, is often a multiplicity of types, some for marginalized communities, some for special needs communities, some for elderly, but often the elderly are not sequestered, isolated from their sons and daughters and their grandchildren. So in a mixed use community that prioritizes their demands and their opportunities and their constraints is really a very, very positive looking model, I think, for the future, particularly as inequality becomes so much more extreme. And then the second thing that I do talk about in the book is in our formal communities where we have such top-down planning, where money comes from government in the tens of millions of dollars. Suddenly there's a high-rise project that is produced nearby. I think our way of doing things in North America is not as efficient and as appropriate as the examples that I see in some so-called third world or developing countries, where the informality of the construction practices mean that there's a high degree of diversity and therefore capacity of their housing types to support all kinds of users, allowing people to age in place, age in and out of their buildings throughout the course of their life. So it's the question you ask is a very, very big one, and I feel frustrated that our contemporary models of thinking about housing are not really very subtle in how they define problems and how they execute solutions.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Here's another one that has a little bit of a comment as well as a question. In North America, many redevelopments are highly regulated, encouraging illegal activities. How can we encourage informal cities and communities where development or redevelopment are highly regulated by zoning codes and policies, particularly in light of many of these codes and policies dating back to earlier eras of the suburb-driven community model that doesn't openly incorporate factors that are needed for communities like businesses or hotels?
Yeah, that's a really challenging one for particularly US communities and to a somewhat lesser extent Canadian communities. And I'll touch on the differences if I get a moment. But the best solution, I think the good news here is that pressure is really building on American and Canadian cities to change. The suburban model, which developed largely in response to automobility and the abundance of post-World War II economy, where we had a much expanded middle class right at the moment when that middle class wanted to have kids in the form of baby boomers like myself. So that the North American landscape is very much 60% sprawl and 40% streetcar suburb with about 5% downtown type of form. So in that 60%, that's really where the challenge lies. And that 60% was designed almost exclusively for two-parent families with 3, 4, 5, 6 kids. And that particular model is what we have out there now. So when we look at the solutions to these problems, it behooves us to rethink what we could do with those subdivisions on those cul-de-sacs. And I think the positive thing for planners that I see is that in many cases, communities, because of the stresses on affordability, because of changing demographics, politicians and neighborhood people are more inclined, at least in my view, in my optimistic view, to listen to strategies for adapting those communities to future demands. Now, for example, the most obvious one that's starting to take root is the secondary suite, or the so-called granny flat, which a lot of communities are now allowing, either legally or by looking the other way, which is what happened in Canada after the 1960s in the city of Vancouver. They just looked the other way when all these illegal suites went in, and I think a lot of smart communities maybe do that. But either legally or illegally allowing those secondary suites to go in. A danger with that is it can be impeded by fire codes and building codes that might require the upgrading of the entire structure, and fire separation and sprinkler systems, which can make the cost of that prohibitive. And each community has to deal with that in a custom-made way by paying attention to health, safety, and welfare. Of course, you don't want people to get killed in a fire and so forth, but probably by instituting a different set of building codes that work to allow for the enhancement and the reconstruction of existing buildings that were built in the 60s and 70s and 80s and no longer are suitable for the old gentleman living alone, the young couple who can't afford that house but could afford to rent a piece of it, extended immigrant families who are coming into the United States and Canada from all over the world with their cousins and with their great grandmother and grandfather. For example, here in the city of Surrey, they've recently updated their code for what they call rooming houses, which really is for extended families for the most part. But the only code they could think of to adapt to it was the rooming house code. And they made it possible for extended families to move into these 4,000 square foot, monster houses, basically, and then subdivide them inside. There may be shared kitchens, there may be additional bathrooms, there may be new doors to the exterior and so forth, but the shell of the building, and importantly, the shell of the garage, which gets converted into living space or even workshop space, becomes available for reuse without tearing down the building. In that way, I think the advantages of the resilience of informality can be brought to what looks like a very formal 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s subdivision landscape. Certainly in the case of the Vancouver suburbs that have done some of this, when you drive down the street, you don't really realize that things have really changed, except perhaps when you see, like 8 cars parked outside, which is not a great thing, but it is an indication that more than one family are taking advantage of this, and probably at a cost advantage to all of them.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Again, a little bit more of a commentary and information. I'm in Dallas, Texas, where the minimum wage is $7.25 per hour, or $1,257 per average month. When you mentioned the middle class disappearing from cities, I thought of the most recent apartment construction here due this spring, where the smallest apartment would be a 550 square foot studio for about $1,615 to $1,700 per month. The location is so-so. At 3 times monthly income, these apartments would require a minimum of $5,100 per month. These apartment developments seem to be interchangeable, loaded with amenities like conference rooms, pool tables, and so on. If the middle class is disappearing from cities, who are these apartments designed for, and where is affordable housing for working people?
Yeah, we have the same problem in Vancouver, and it's a problem in every city in America now. And the disparity between minimum wage and entry-level rents is a disgrace to the human race, as Jimmy Carter used to say. And that's why in the book I devote a lot of attention to trying to understand how municipalities can intervene in the housing market in a way that can make it possible for people to dedicate a maximum of 30% of their income towards that rental unit. Right now in the United States, we have Section 8 vouchers that are inadequate to the demand. I think the statistic I looked at is that only 20% of the eligible Americans can access those. So they get a certain amount of money to put towards their rent if they're below a certain threshold of income, and certainly anybody making minimum wage or has a family would qualify, but the vouchers are not there. And even then, the complaint about the voucher system is that it just provides a subsidy to landlords at the end of the day, and the value of the rental buildings, the value of the land basically under these rental buildings keeps inflating and inflating, and the real estate investment trusts keep going in there and buying up all the existing rental housing stock, which they did after the 2008 financial collapse, and it appears that they're doing the same thing now in the midst of this COVID problem. So in my research, in my examination, I really don't think there's really much we can do unless we fundamentally alter the North American economy at the local level, besides look for ways to expand the inventory of non-market housing, and in so doing, try to extract the maximum amount of land, urban land possible, from the vagaries of the marketplace. Again, going back to the Vienna example, that's exactly what they did. They had 100 years to do it, which we don't really have, but we got to start on Monday. We have to do something about this problem. And how that worked was because they eventually acquired so much land, so much residential fabric, the dirt underneath new and existing buildings, that they were able to influence the market and how the market operated, which provided downward pressure on the value of market land. See, in our analysis, it's really the value of urban land which is out of control. It's not the price of the building that's out of the structure itself that's out of control. It's the price of the land underneath it, which is calibrated based on, coming back to your question, which is calibrated based on what the high end of the market is willing to pay for a unit. So that's where the whole calculus starts. They say, okay, I can get $3,000 for this 2-bedroom apartment. So the building's going to cost me $200 a square foot. I need my profit. I'll get permitting fees. How much is left based on that rent for me to pay for the land? And that calculus, which starts with the high end of what you can get for a new apartment building, ends up inflating the value of the dirt underneath that project. So under present circumstances, inequality in both Canada and the United States in particular is really, at the moment, most manifest in the difficulty of gaining access to housing. And the biggest reason people can't gain access to housing is that because of global asset inflation across the board affecting stocks, bonds, gold, you name it, even stocks during this COVID pandemic have remained immune to collapse. And that's a representation of this global problem of asset inflation, and some huge chunk of global wealth in the hundreds of trillions of dollars is in urban land, not in farmland, but in urban land. So that's where wealth is going. And because wealth is looking for a place to park and get its guaranteed 5%, that's what's driving up the value of urban land all over the developed world for sure, and even the undeveloped world. It might come as a surprise to some of you that developable land around the world, the most expensive land to develop, if you can find a parcel, the most expensive parcel, the most expensive square foot of land in the world is Mumbai, India, which most of us in North America consider to be a slum. So this has been a long-winded answer to your very direct question. And I've got my frustrating response, I suppose, is that I don't see an economic solution to affordable housing absent local insistence on acquiring a substantial amount of urban residential land and then supplying non-market alternatives to the housing market, both to mitigate the extreme increase in the value of the urban land, urban land, and also at the same time provide housing, importantly, to minimum wage earners, but also people making twice that amount or 3 times that amount who can't afford these crazy rents and still have anything left to feed their family and take a week's vacation at the lake. So that's the best I can offer for solutions on that one. I know it's not hopeful, but there isn't any other choice I see.
Great, thank you. And there are a couple of questions kind of related to what you were just saying, and I'll kind of move one to one of them here. Do you have a definition and examples of what the middle class is over time and geographies? And please speak to how planners can address demographic trends that impede the development of inclusive and diverse communities.
Yeah, the definition of the middle class is various statistics that sort of define it, but the way I like to think about it is when I was growing up, the guy who stocks shelves or the butcher at the supermarket or the custodian at the school, as well as the teacher, obviously, could buy a house, could buy a 5-room ranch, and could buy a new Chevy every 3 years, and could have 2 weeks at the lake. And kids had enough shoes. And when it came time to go to send the kids to college, they could afford to do so, largely because, of course, college back in those days, there were state colleges that didn't cost anything, and the private schools cost a tiny fraction of what they cost now. So if you look at basic lifestyle and compare it to what the millennial generation, I guess Gen X as well, and the generation, what do they call them, Gen Y now too, particularly Gen X and Gen Y, if you look at what they're up against, nobody who is a custodian or who works in a factory or who delivers for FedEx, these million service jobs can afford that, even when they have two incomes. So the definition of what is middle class is not kept up with the qualitative realities of the struggle of a very changed America. Part of that has to do with low wages, but the other part of it has to do with the high cost in comparative terms when you look at fundamental goods, housing, education, not so much food, but housing and education and healthcare have become ridiculously expensive in comparison to the very limited increase in purchasing power for the average American worker, the person making the average 40,000 or whatever it is these days. There was another question, Michael, that I think I've forgotten. There was another aspect of this in the second half. Can you repeat that for me?
Let me go back here. Yes, speak to how planners can address demographic trends that impede the development of inclusive and diverse communities.
Yeah, can you repeat the first sentence in that? I couldn't quite get the key word.
Well, the first part was about the definition and examples of middle class over time, and then speak to how planners can address demographic trends that impede the development of inclusive and diverse communities.
How planets can adjust?
How
Second
planners
word.
can address.
How planning. Oh, how planning.
Yes.
How planning can adjust what? I'm sorry.
How planners can address the trends that impede the development of inclusive and diverse communities.
Yeah, I would thank you. I'm sorry for my inability to hear that question, Michael. I would maybe at the risk of repeating myself, say that one of the main messages of the book is the value of informality, and for planners struggling with this question of how to accommodate these different demographics, both age demographics and income demographics. I'll go back to an answer to a previous question, which is to look at your community and try to assess the housing stock that's there. For most of the people working in planning, you have a significant inventory of suburban house types that were built in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and how that might be readjusted for existing demographics. One thing that's going on, to give you an example, one thing that goes on here in Vancouver is that because of the way the demographic trends have evolved between the baby boom era and this era, we have a lot of people in the city of Vancouver who are sitting on houses with empty bedrooms, and the tax value of their properties might be in the millions of dollars. However, their income is only like $1,000 a month. So these people are constrained, and they don't really want to move out of the home that they've lived in for their whole life. And yet policies are impeding them from taking advantage of opportunities to extract the equity out of the home without selling it. An opportunity to extract the equity out of the home is to take a part of that home and convert it into a usable space for a separate demographic. Now that might be their own children, and it often is, but more frequently it's for some other family who, by virtue of the fact that this space has become available in that building, are able to live in a nice neighborhood. They're able to go to the school, which would otherwise be emptying out because all the baby boomers' kids are long gone, and it evens out. The taxes flowing into the local school system. There's a lot of follow-on benefits that flow from really looking at your housing stock in a more sophisticated way. And that would be the big one. And then the second part of that is that in terms of new housing for demographics that are under pressure, what are those demographics? Basically, in North American cities, it's mostly people who are making modest wages, who are under the age of 40, who would like to get married, who would like to have kids, but can't do that. That's a big demographic. There is another big demographic, which is people who may have a partner but don't want to have kids, who have an entirely different set of needs. And then there's this demographic of people who are, like my age, 60 to 80 years old, who have inherited the fabric of the community but are unable to afford the cost of its upkeep, uh, who need planners to provide opportunities for them to extract the equity out of that in a way that benefits the rest of the community. Uh, these answers sound potentially frustrating and hard, but the upside of it is I think in the next 10, 20, 30 years, the opportunities for planners to very carefully look at these questions and to come up with practical, not only practical solutions, but politically viable within your communities through explaining the situation in the ways that I've tried to do, but perhaps with more elegance and more political sensitivity than I'm required to provide, to get the elected officials in those communities to adjust their planning policies and their bylaws and so forth to allow these things to happen. In the absence of that, many communities are going to have continued trouble. So the upside is, I think, the problems that we're talking about are very much addressable at the local level. We don't have to wait for the state or the province or the nation to dump a whole bunch of cash into our communities because the economic value is already there. The economic value is mostly wrapped up in the value of that urban land. And planners, once they see this, once they have that insight, can therefore try to engineer a way to get the value of that land to flow into socially advantageous directions. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. A lot of questions in this vein, actually. Do you believe that the reliance on supply increase can help provide affordable housing, or will it only occur with the strategic investments that you discussed, like public land use and so on?
This may vary from place to place, but I used to be a supply guy in the city of Vancouver, like most urbanists. And it's only within the last 10 to 12 years that I've given up on supply. Because as the book tries to point out, if you look around the world, the increase in land value that is causing the problems of affordability does not seem to be mitigated whether you're in a low supply situation or a high supply situation. In both of those cases, the value of that new urban supply is priced more or less, if you're in one of these so-called global cities, like on the coasts of the United States, for example, here in Vancouver or Toronto or places like Sydney and Melbourne and Shanghai and wherever else, London, the entire south end of England and so forth. If you're in one of those difficult to afford places, it doesn't matter how much new supply you put out there, it never trickles down. It doesn't conform anymore to the so-called laws of supply and demand. And I think that actually is quite an imposition, quite a problem for planners, because it certainly still is here, where I should think it would be very obvious that the laws of supply and demand don't really work in Vancouver, because Vancouver has produced more housing than population growth for a number of years, and yet the price keeps on going up and up. This goes back to the problem of global asset inflation. Doesn't matter where you are, assets are scarce. A lot of people have money these days. Cash is cheap. You can get cash now during this COVID thing at pretty close to 0%. You can turn around and put it into real estate around the globe and be pretty sure you're going to get 5% back. We'll see what happens, with COVID and how this all shakes out, but it hasn't hurt people putting that money in the stock market, that's for sure, so far. So we're living in a different world where supply doesn't matter. All asset classes, including housing, are inflating. Global asset inflation and the price of money being so cheap is a much bigger problem than what local planners and developers can do in terms of adding new supply. That is why there's a two-sided recommendation, I would say. Look at your existing fabric for a way that you can insinuate new housing units without distorting the market. That's why adding secondary suites is probably a better strategy in terms of affordability than building a new apartment building with the same number of units. Because it's my observation that adding the units in an existing house has a far smaller inflationary effect on the value of land. It has some inflationary effect in terms of the value of that property, but nothing like a new condo tower, with a swimming pool and all that kind of stuff down the street. And then, I keep coming back to the same thing at the local and national and state and provincial level, but certainly at the local level, to try to extract as much land as much of your land base from the vagaries of the global housing market as you can. Start by looking at housing projects that already exist. Start by thinking about ways to take. Here in Vancouver, we have a fairly robust set of local development taxes. They're called community amenity contributions and development cost levies, but in the United States, you have they're called by a different name, but basically it's a charge on development. A lot of people criticize those because they presume that they increase the price of housing, but that's not the case. They end up reducing the price of the land underneath the new housing. And that money can be used, certainly here in Vancouver, it might be different from state to state in the United States. You'll have to examine that. But the best idea is to stream development taxes, which has the effect of lowering the value of land prices, and take that money gained and use that towards the creation of non-market housing. Remember that when you're able to successfully do that, when you go into the market to buy land for non-market housing, because you've taxed development to get that money, you've done two things. You've gotten the money that you need. You've also reduced the market price of developable land, so the public entity, doesn't have to be a city, it can be a non-governmental organization, can go in and buy land at a reduced price and use that money from taxes for that purposes. And then the other thing about non-market housing that I want to mention here is it's very different than the idea of subsidized housing. Non-market housing, in most cases, like take housing co-ops as an example, can and should really be profitable, because over a long amortization period, the people who go in there and who are paying rents are paying off the construction and to some extent the land costs. Remember that land is the difficult nut to crack in this one, but certainly paying off the construction costs, and in the future paying off the cost of the new roof and the new skin on the house and whatever else, the new boiler, which you need every 15 years or whatever else. It's different than public housing, the housing projects, which are a continued drain in many cases on the public purse, which makes them politically difficult for voters and their elected representatives to get behind. If the message goes out that this isn't really a continuous tax subsidy, this is a different kind of market strategy, which separates these non-market housing units from the damaging influence of a global urban land market, which is out of control. And again, Michael, I'll leave it at that and see what the next question is.
Okay. Interesting in terms of use relative to the housing need. Here's the next question. Many cities are buying up hotels to use as temporary shelters and may keep them in the long term as housing for unhoused people. I was wondering if you see this pandemic as an opportunity for governments to make big moves in financing non-market housing, and if so, how cities might make it happen given major expected budget shortfalls.
Yeah, it's a problem and an opportunity, isn't it? I don't have a crystal ball on that one. I'll just share what I think is a feeling shared by many of you listening at the moment. We both have the opportunity to deal with what is another disgrace to the human race, which is the homeless, which is a situation that didn't exist when I was a kid in the 1960s. And suddenly it's something that we've sort of taken for granted. The pandemic means that people living on our street, it's not only a humanitarian crisis, it's also a health crisis that may influence, it may enhance the spread of disease to other people who have homes, which is creating an opportunity for us to deal with it. The short term is because nobody's in these hotels. Well, let's put the homeless in there, which is a very good short term response. For me, in my discussions, when I get an opportunity to speak to this, when I try to put the homeless question attached to the problem of low income individuals or families who are also experiencing precarious housing. If you look at the statistics of homelessness around the North America, you'll see some are severely disabled with issues of abuse and substance abuse that is a consequence of abuse in childhood and all these kind of horror stories that are really awful to ponder. But a very significant percentage of the homeless in our city had a home within 12 months. So it's just that they're in this much larger category of people, who are only $400 away from being thrown out on the street and not having a place to live anymore. A lot of people are moving in and out of homelessness. So the homeless question is not primarily, I try to say the homeless question is not primarily a problem of this very distinct cohort. It's part of a housing continuum, all experiencing different kinds of housing, precarious housing pressures. So if we can define it in those terms and then look again at the housing stock in our cities and to try to figure out as planners how we can take the wealth of the community, which is getting tied up in the value of land, and extract a significant percentage of that to deal with a broad housing question, which includes housing for those who are making $7 an hour and struggling, restocking the grocery stores for you every day and subjecting themselves to the dangers of COVID, uh, orderlies in hospitals and so forth. If you really look at the people at the low end of the wage spectrum, they're the people who are keeping us alive. It's not the computer programmers. So if we take upon ourselves a new responsibility to this large cohort, unless we're going to double the minimum wage or quadruple the minimum wage, to attach that cohort that is making less money than they need to adequately house themselves to those who have fallen out of housing and see them as part of the same problem, I think it changes the way we address the problem, and it also changes the way the public dialogue occurs, because this is not just these poor souls that are addicts. It's maybe our sons and daughters or our grandkids who are having trouble. So it puts it within a larger community frame, which is in this era of unbelievable inequality in America. Unless we see major revolutionary changes politically, I think probably the next 10 to 20 years is not going to be much different than this particular decade. But what we can do is to take this new crisis, as well as the inequality crisis, reframe the question of housing around the question of urban land, how to use the urban land resource, which is more belonging to us as a community than it is to land speculators, which are getting all the advantage of these price increases now. Then I think we have some hope. That's the best I can do, Michael, on that one. Thank you.
Okay. No, thank you. That was quite an extensive response to that one. Here's another question about something you brought up in the presentation. While the informal city may not be the most interesting, or may be the most interesting, do you think that in the US and Canada that we are forced to regulate and create the formal city? Because if we don't, there will be lawsuits. Lawsuits, in my experience as a US city planner, are so common. Informal cities are lawsuits after unfavorable land use and site plan decisions also a common occurrence?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. You know, the South American favela, which I use as an example, they do occur absent any regulation, and there are fire issues, there are health and safety issues, there are access to emergency vehicles issues. There's a whole bunch of issues that we probably don't want to replicate. And in the book, I try to say, here's what we would take from informality. Here's what we probably wouldn't take. So there's a kind of a menu of things you might try to get and things you wouldn't really want. The things you wouldn't really want have to do with safety and hygiene largely. So where I would make a suggestion for North American planners is that, you know, when we look at these formal projects, particularly large scale projects in our downtowns, which some of you are lucky enough to deal with, they're usually in the form of these $100 million projects or even multi-billion dollar projects in some of the larger cities on very large parcels. And, you know, I think that's generally a mistake because I think those things are not very nice when you go to these places like Empire Plaza in Albany, New York is probably one of the most frightening, horrifying places I've ever been in my whole life. And also the new project in Manhattan, whatever that one is, Hudson Yards, is scares the bejesus out of me. So a lot of these projects are, you assemble this huge amount of capital from the globe and you dump it into this very large place, and there it sits. And it's always disappointing. There's very few examples of that besides Rockefeller Center done in the 1930s that really are very rich and rewarding and economically viable for that matter. The response, I think, in North American communities that you can use today that won't get you in trouble with, you know, lawsuits or violations of building codes is to try to enhance the acceptability of small block design, and therefore small parcel configuration. And in this one, I'm clearly a new urbanist, believe very strongly in the idea of small parcel, small block. There's an economic side to that, which is very advantageous. If you have small parcels, even if the floor surface ratios are quite high with party wall construction, you can get small developers to take on the small parcel project, and the small developers will, you know, more often than not hire local people to do it and so forth. And the small block configuration gives you an aesthetic much like Portland's downtown and even Manhattan for that matter. So for the problem of the overregulation of the American urban landscape, when planners have an opportunity to establish a street and parcel configuration, that's your golden opportunity to remember that small is beautiful. Small blocks and small parcels. I know that developers will say that they're diseconomic. Sometimes they argue based on the need for underground parking structures is the real driver for large parcel development. But I think it's worth digging your heels in on that one, because I think there's fairly good scientific evidence that in terms of user comfort as well as long-term profitability, a collection of small projects can be more economically viable and certainly more resilient and adaptable to future circumstances than these big, you know, shopping mall scale projects that I see still cropping up in the fever dreams of you know, many urban design developers. Small parcel, small block. Michael, that's it.
Okay, great. And thanks for taking the time. So we'll have one more question before we ask you for your final thoughts. And there's a little comment here as well. Patrick, thank you for the discussion, but in this entire time, you didn't mention anything about safety or crime, the very things that Jane Jacobs did talk about. How do your principles relate to crime and safety?
They relate a lot. Maybe those got underplayed in my presentation. they're touched on very much so in the book. Jane Jacobs, the legacy of Jane Jacobs and people like Christopher Alexander are very important in my thinking and in the book. Uh, and they show up. One way to describe what I was trying to do is to take the work of the legacy of Jane Jacobs and Christopher Alexander and the people in that strain of thinking, systems thinking, bring that forward to our current problem of our current problems of kind of massive social and economic inequality and urban migration and demographic shift, which are the three great waves. So embedded in that is the idea of small scale individual opportunity to develop and the resilience of that format that we can see emerging. We see it most vividly in informal communities around the world, but we also see it emerging now in subtle forms in mixed-use zoning and live-work housing and secondary suites in our suburban fabric. And also in the book, and also very strong in my belief, is that when you do that, it brings attention to the public realm, which is usually the street. And in the answer to my first question today, also the ancillary spaces of the plaza or the square, and surrounded by buildings which have eyes on the street. So what I'm trying to say in the book is that maybe it's not that well recognized in the work of Jane Jacobs that the issue really is scale of intervention. When she celebrates Greenwich Village, she's really celebrating a party wall construction where the average building is basically less than 50 feet frontage. So on any particular block, there's 4 or more individual buildings with at least 4 or more individual entrances to the building and a whole bunch of windows that go right onto the street. That same kind of presence on the street is very, very evident in all of the favelas of South America. It's an informal thing that just happens automatically because the land is so precious. They build the street wall right up to the public realm, but that sure means that you can see right into the living room. You can see the living spaces. One of my most powerful experiences was in Mumbai, where these really very narrow streets in what looked from a distance like a slum. When you walk down the street, though, all the portals to the buildings were wide open, and pretty much every building that I went past, there was a mosaic floor with incredibly intricate tile work that was so beautiful. And yet that foyer, that living room space, what we would think of as a living room, was built to be expressed into the street itself, so that there was this absolute attachment between the public realm of the street and what was effectively the private realm of the home, but it was a semi-private realm. Certainly nobody put their bed in the middle of that room, because that would be very inappropriate. But in terms of their conversation when they're together as a family, when they're doing this and that, those spaces enhanced a connection between the indoors and the outdoors, which I think was what Jane Jacobs was really all about. And it was a matter of the intimacy of the scale relationship between the elements of the interior of the building and the elements of the public realm, which to some extent shared that membrane. I call it, when I talk to my students, thick wall design, which, what I mean by that is that the building is not a blank wall. The building at best should be a series of layers of connection, which in Jane Jacobs terms, you get the street, then the sidewalk, then the stoop, then the porch, then the foyer, then the bay window, which sticks out, and the curtains are pulled back so the front room addresses the street, and people in that front room can provide eyes on the street. The stuff that she identified is even more apparent in the informality of so-called slum and favela places around the world. So thank you for the question, because that's inherent in my thinking and inherent in what has made me think that these informal communities are a source of inspiration for what we might do in the future.
Great, thanks, Patrick. I guess one last real quick follow-up. Can non-market housing ever be truly informal?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. The answer is sort of, I guess, sort of. Some of the examples in Vienna are quite interesting in how they try to build user adaptability into it. It tends to be, those examples are worth looking at, whoever it was that asked the question and the rest of you listening in. Those examples from an architectural perspective are quite interesting, because some of them are fairly large projects, let's say 2-acre project, and architecturally look relatively similar across the whole project. But when you get inside the building, all the interior partition walls are up for grabs, and they can be adjusted and readjusted throughout the future. So that's one way to say that skillful architects can build in informality into formality. The other way is it is quite possible for a non-governmental organization to parcelize a site and then working with subcontracting other non-governmental organizations or public housing agencies to go in and say, okay, I'm on this little parcel, this 3,000 square foot parcel, I'm going to drop this in. And the overarching entity will say, well, all I really care about is that you put a party wall in and you plug your utilities in here, and that the people who go in there are going to be able to afford it at 30% of their income forevermore. And then let the architecture, leave the architectural decisions more or less alone. That's very much a traditional North American party wall townhouse type of strategy. You know, in actual fact, when you look at the parts of North American cities that developed that way in Toronto and in New York City and so forth, Philadelphia, it ended up that the building construction industry ended up having a way of doing things and meeting code and doing it cheaply enough that the buildings ended up looking fairly similar across the way, different color paint on the porches, different window trim and so forth. But the typology, the structure ended up being very much the same, because it was a matter of efficient building construction. And there are some contemporary examples that have done that. And I think that's a very much recommended strategy to get. It's not just informality for informality's sake. Please remember that it's informality for economic efficiency and future resilience and adaptability. Those are the key things. And I think the side benefit of that is that it creates a great city, in my view.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Patrick, for taking on all these questions, and thanks to everybody who submitted them. Just wondering if you have any final thoughts for us today.
The only final thought is the overarching one. For those of you listening in who are in your late 20s and 30s, early 20s even, you know, you've got 30, 40 years in front of you of dealing with these issues. And I know it might be kind of frightening under present circumstances, but if I had my life to live over again, I think it would be really very, very interesting to be a planner or a designer of any kind in this future situation, where we really have to adapt the existing urban construct to our future sustainable circumstances. To do otherwise, we're really toast. I like to tell my students that, you know, none of you is going to be able to save the world all by yourself, but I like to think about it as maybe there's about 200,000 maybe as many as 400,000 people around the globe who are collectively going to fix this planet. It's these social issues, obviously the climate change issues, the economic issues, such that at the ends of your career, you can say, I had a part in that. And I think that'll be a very satisfying thing to think at the ends of your career. And I know it's difficult, but if it was difficult, it wouldn't be, if it wasn't difficult, it wouldn't be worth doing. So good luck and good fortune.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Patrick, for joining us today.
Sure. My pleasure. Thank you, Michael.
Okay, I think we're going to end it. We're going to shut it off.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Thanks, John. Thanks, everybody listening.
Great. Appreciate you doing this again.
Yeah, I appreciate the work that you guys have put in too.
Great.
Thank you. Thanks very much. And if there's anything else you need from me, just let me know.
Okay. We want to thank everybody for being here today and for participating in the webinar, Designing Cities Amid Urban Migration, Demographic Shift, and a Disappearing Middle Class. I'd like to offer a big thank you to Patrick for his presentation and to all who attended, and John Coleman, our communication technology expert, who made this all happen. Complete recording of the web will be posted on smart.org. For those who've been requesting one, all attendees will receive an email that will contain a link to a personalized certificate of participation. Please look for the follow-up email. When you exit from today's webinar, you'll be asked to participate in a short evaluation. Please take a few moments to provide feedback so that we can continue to improve the webinar experience for you. And keep an eye on smartgrowth.org in your email inbox for details on other future webinars, including next week's autonomous vehicle implications for transportation planning with Todd Littman next Friday. Visit smartgrowth.org and watch for our blast for more information on future webinars. Have a great day.